That's the stage of the company we were in the summer, which is like, taped together, popsicle stick and duct tape phase. And part of me is a little embarrassed by that, and then part of me is like super proud of that. And I think it's fair to kind of tread in the middle, right? I think that you don't want to be there long term, but this is what it takes, I would say, in the early days to make something work. The React product will not compare to the Bubble product, but we wouldn't have been able to build the React product with the conviction that we have had we not built the Bubble product. So it's kind of like a chicken or the egg thing.
Today I'm speaking with Campbell Barron. Campbell is the founder and CEO of Montra, a video creation platform that allows you to turn your slides into beautiful video presentations. If people were stocks, I'd invest in Campbell. He's only 19 years old and his why is well beyond his age. Together we discussed the role that no-code played in Montra's early days, Campbell's experience raising money to run his startup, and the challenges of gathering and listening to user feedback. If you're enjoying these conversations, make sure to like and subscribe, and without further ado, here's Campbell. Okay, Campbell, thanks for joining me today. Let's start with a really simple question. What is Montra? Give me your elevator pitch.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Jacob. I appreciate the opportunity to be an early guest on the pod. Yeah, so let's jump into Montra. So what is Montra? Well, I think to kind of understand Montra, the general pitch I would give is it's helpful to kind of understand video and how it's transformed over the last decade. So I kind of started editing video when I was relatively young, kind of on the family iPad, and then worked my way up through kind of various pro video software. And 10 years ago, when you were creating video, it was very much a, entertainment mechanism. You were like an early YouTuber, or maybe you were making home movies or whatever the use case was. Maybe you were making a TV show or a film. All was really meant to be consumed from an entertainment perspective. 10 years later, the use cases for video have exploded, right? And video is much more than an entertainment mechanism. It is much more of a communication mechanism. But if we kind of look back on the last 10 years and I kind of reflect on my experience creating videos, I had a podcast and a TikTok account, which was ultimately acquired, and have spent a lot of time. I even worked at the CBC for 2 years. The reality is video and the way we create video really hasn't changed that much, right? The tools you want, one may want to use to create high quality content, is very similar to kind of the tools you would use 10 years ago. Final Cut Pro, Premiere Pro basically look the same. And so I kind of was reflecting on my time creating content, realized, hey, the use cases for video have exploded, yet there's so many kind of crappy screen recorded videos circulating around the web. How can we build a very easy way, that empowers anyone, wherever they are, wherever their background is, etc., to create compelling videos? And kind of stumbled upon this, idea that you have to leverage a familiar user interface, and if there is going to be no learning curve associated with creating content, you have to strip out everything that's true with an existing video creation tool and start from scratch. And that to us was PowerPoint and Google Slides. And so I became really interested in this idea. What if we turn Google Slides into PowerPoint or into a video creation tool? And, long story short, that's Montra, and that's what we're building.
Amazing. Okay, so take me back to those early days. Like, you have this idea and you have a co-founder, right?
I do, yeah. But the early days, it was just me, actually.
Okay, so take me back to then. First of all, I guess, how do you find your co-founder?
Mm-hmm.
What was that conversation like? And then I'm also curious to know, how soon did conversations about your tech stack come into the picture that eventually led you to start building your product on Bubble?
Yeah. So right away, the tech stack, to answer the tech stack question, it was right away. I had sold the TikTok account and was excited about video tools. But the original idea for Montra was not called Montra. It was called a product called Simple Pitch. And basically what Simple Pitch was a way to turn a presentation and turn a deck into a narrative presentation. So it was like half of Montra, but the original idea wasn't that you're going to export your videos, is we were going to help people, pitch things, sell things, etc. It was a very early iteration. And it did leverage the interface of Google Slides, but it was very basic. It was audio over slides. And I built that myself, originally on Figma and then via Bubble. What had happened was, before I met my co-founder, Niels, who I met him through TikTok. He just was a fan of my TikTok account or follower, whatever you want to call it, DM'd me. We became friends, and I would fill him in on on the progress I was making, and he increasingly got more and more excited. But before Niels, I actually teamed up with a startup studio called Creme Digital. I'll give them a shout out because they're the reason why we're in this position we are today. And they are a no-code startup studio built off of the backs of basically their agency that they've worked with brands like Creator Now and all sorts of really cool companies building and designing kind of no-code products, but they have a really, really great emphasis on design. And ultimately, it was started by my friend, and I teamed up with them kind of early on because I kind of knew that the reality is that this kind of little prototype I was building, probably wouldn't go anywhere if I didn't kind of have other guidance and I would say input from third parties that wasn't me. And I didn't have a co-founder at the time. I wasn't technical. And so our original idea was to see how far we can get on Bubble. And we both saw, myself and Creme Digital, who was a minority shareholder, but, kind of in exchange for that was able to, I would say, we were able to kind of leverage their design and development resources. We were really excited about Bubble as a mechanism for prototyping products, building really quickly, a step up from a Figma prototype that I kind of started out with, and, a step down from kind of a more production scale, I would say tech stack, if you will. But the reality is that you can build a lot quicker with Bubble, and we kind of acknowledged that pretty quickly. So, but we were not like relentlessly building until really January, February, I would say, because we spent a lot of time from September through January just in exploration mode. Creme and the team there really pushed me to kind of embrace talking to users, something that I'm really appreciative today because we do it quite frequently. And at that point in time, we were really excited by this idea that, hey, what would it look like, to empower people to create engaging videos? And we initially thought maybe that would look like, focusing on the education market. And so that was kind of our initial positioning when we kind of started out building our product.
Okay, so let's rewind a bit. You have this idea and you start building this prototype yourself then, and you said that you're non-technical, so you start learning Bubble. Why was it important for you to start learning how to build this product yourself? If it was important, was it more that you were?
It was a necessity, man.
Okay. Tell me more about that.
Yeah, I was always interested in startups and tech for a long time. I tried to learn to code many times, and I just hated it. I was just a fucking awful developer. I don't know if I can swear. I could redo that if that works.
No.
Okay, I was not a good developer, right? And so, but I really, and I felt really constrained by that because, I would spend hours and hours and hours trying to like change the color of a button, or build like a very basic HTML site. But yet my ambitions and ideas for technology were video creation tools, things that were so out of reach. And so Bubble, I found out about it, I think through a TED talk. I don't know, maybe a while ago, maybe could have been through a forum, 2017 maybe. And I basically just became interested in it and always looked to Bubble for many of the kind of little side projects I worked on throughout high school. And then ultimately when, I built this little prototype of Simple Pitch myself, I kind of took that to the studio and that was kind of the starting point. But we were not doing a lot of Bubble building from September to January. It was really until January we felt that, hey, we don't have a ton of confidence yet beyond these conversations that we're onto something. So instead of, investing too much resources in building an entire video creation tool from scratch with React and, some Django backend, like, why don't we just do it on Bubble, and how far can we push it? And so the reality is that it was much more of a necessity and less of an important skill for me. And I should say that for the entire prototyping stage of Montra, especially as it was built on Bubble, it was total duct tape and popsicle stick phase, but that doesn't neglect the amount of work that went into it. And the reality is that I think, you have to look at a project on Bubble like anything else, right? And from our perspective, that was, a project where we had Bubble developers, right? And my co-founder, Niels, who is not a Bubble developer, who's very technical, really embraced Bubble for those first few months because he acknowledged the speed at which we can, test things and learn, even though things weren't working 100% of the time.
Yeah, I definitely want to dive into some of the technical challenges that you guys faced. I know that back when we first met, you were in the middle of putting out all of those fires. We'll get into those in a minute, but at what point does raising money enter into the conversation or into Montra's into the conversation?
Raising money was always a goal. I think the reality is that we kind of realized that this was not going to be a startup that was going to be bootstrapped because, the long-term end goal was, the reality is Bubble and whatever tech stack you use and I don't want to say it's irrelevant, but it's a means to an end, right? The long-term goal was how could we build a video creation tool that empowered anyone, no matter their skill set, to come to the service and make an engaging video at the end. That's what we were trying to do. And to do that, it requires a lot of engineering resources, period. And the reality is most of those resources, that we were, we had were allocated towards Bubble because of the speed at which we can accomplish that goal. But we knew that we were going to need some capital to be able to get up and running. And, this was my first time actually really trying to fundraise. And we started in February and we kind of ended in April. Took a long time. Felt like a long time. I got a ton of rejections, just relentlessly pitching people. And the goal was to, we really wanted to raise $500,000 USD so that we can have 18 months to figure this out. And, my co-founder could, stay in the country and pay himself because he was an immigrant from Germany. And we could have a little bit of resources where we could hire some contractors to help us, further test the product. We did not have this grant. Our pitch was not super clean. It was not tight. We raised another round of financing much more recently. And the reality is that went way better than the first time around. And the first time around, it was painful. And, you just have to keep going and be persistent. But generally speaking, it's a lot of cold emailing. It's a lot of following up. It's a lot of trying to string these conversations together and put together a round from a bunch of strangers that you've never met. And I was 19, still am 19. And kind of a track record that was somewhat cool, but I've never built a startup before, right? And so there's always that question. There was a big question mark regarding the product. And frankly, there's a big question mark regarding the market. Keep in mind, we started February and then March, April, market starts to tank, right? And that didn't help, I can tell you that much. But ultimately, we managed to, kind of push through those rejections, put together a round, and we hit the ground running with the summer and really sprinting from a Bubble perspective, trying to push the product as far as we possibly could. And, despite the technical challenges, felt it was a really wonderful way that we can learn and iterate on a very micro scale.
Yeah, I've never raised money myself. It always seems it's always seemed like one of those things that's just a mystery. I guess people just go out there and raise money somehow. So it's comforting to know that really it's no different than trying to do anything else in the sense that you just keep knocking on doors until you get a yes. And I'm curious to know, as you were speaking there, I had the thought, what was that like when you, as a first-time founder who's 19 years old, I know you had founded something else, and what was it before? I was looking at on Twitter. It was like a TikTok channel that got acquired.
I had a TikTok account, but that was not a startup, right? That was not a tech company. I was not building any proprietary tech, and it was a very different experience in Montra, I can tell you that.
So what was that like as a first-time startup founder, 19 years old, building out this product on Bubble, building it yourself, and getting grilled by these investors? How did that affect the way that you thought about what you were doing, if at all?
Yeah. So I'll say, so I can say this, right? The biggest mistake I made was the positioning of the product. We had a lot of early conversations with educators, course creators, and naively assumed that was the only use case that we should really focus on. And so the market size, the challenges around that market, being perceived as too small was a major turnoff. And so a lot of the fundraising challenges that we faced were self-inflicted. Bubble really was irrelevant and to the conversation because it's just the tech stack. At the time, it was we had this prototype, right? And that was that. And, we were going to launch and test the prototype in the summer. But the front end
Did that
Bubble.
Come up at all though in the conversations with investors? No, never?
Not really. No. Because, they care, they don't really care, right? They care about the product. It's and I think, to be honest, if it is, then you're kind of talking to the wrong people, right? Most investors shouldn't care. They should care a lot more about the product and the goals and the positioning. And I think, our goal was not, I think it would be more relevant if we were we are a Bubble company that will always be built on Bubble from day 0 to 100. And that was never really our goal. My co-founder and I kind of knew pretty early on, we're going to have to leave Bubble eventually, but let's just stay on as long as we can so we feel, or as long as it takes for us to properly test this product. And so from that perspective, the conversations were much more centered around the product and the vision and the design, right? I cannot understate how valuable Creme was from a design perspective. Really great design matters. And that's what we were able to execute. And, we had these prototypes that we were able to kind of show investors that were beneficial. And some of the stuff in the prototypes we still leverage today, and a lot of it we don't, right? And so it's an iterative process, and it just takes a lot of time to figure out. And a lot of these things that are obvious in hindsight aren't in the moment. And I think that's kind of one of the biggest learnings from that. I mean, among 100 other mistakes I made, but I would say like when you raise money, what you build on is irrelevant. And like, I mean, maybe even a critique with like the Web3 startups, right? Like it doesn't matter what blockchain you're on, or, it's like, how are your customers, how are your users going to be able to do something they couldn't have done before? And I think that's true. And whether it's built on Bubble or Adalo or, React, like who cares, right? It's a product. Are people interested in using it? And how did you kind of come to that conclusion? So that's basically what I think about a little, but we're still very early on, right? There's a long road ahead of us. And, I would say that the Bubble product was definitely beneficial from a beta testing perspective, but, to kind of bet the company on that was something that was not, was definitely not something we were going to do. That's for sure.
Yeah, I think as developers too, I think it's easy to kind of obsess about your tech stack and all of these different cool tools that are available. But I love what you said about, I mean, at the end of the day, you're just trying to give users a great experience and build a great product. And it's comforting to know too that investors who are serious about investing in great startups really, I agree with you. I mean, I think that's all that matters at the end of the day. Tech stack is kind of irrelevant. Ultimately, You're just solving a problem and building something cool.
Yeah, if I will say one thing on that. If I was a solo founder with no CTO, I probably wouldn't have been able to raise money at all. The reality is no code is not true. Bubble's not no code. Bubble can be no code, but we were not no code. There's a lot of code involved in Montra built on Bubble. The front end just happened to be on Bubble. We kind of get into that. What that beta testing period did for us was it allowed us to really figure out what APIs we want to use, so that now when we're rebuilding our product in React and kind of a more robust tech stack, all of the trial and error with APIs, that's gone. We're done. We figured it out. And so, I mean, I don't want to say 100%, but the vast majority of the question marks around how do you build a video creation tool are solved for. And that speeds up our timeline. And so, the reality is Niels is an incredible developer. I would not be here without him. And so when we kind of think about Bubble and how we leverage it, he leveraged it as much as I did. I was not from January onwards, I did not change a single thing in Bubble. I did not touch the product. I maybe changed some text, right? And those are my contributions. My goal was to build an awesome team and to raise money, right? And so, and help with kind of product positioning and all of the things that mattered that move the company forward. But
do you ever feel that role that you just described there come into conflict though? Because it seems like very much at the beginning, you were building this prototype yourself. You're learning how to use Bubble. You're learning all of this stuff about product development from a technical perspective. I guess my question is, how did that impact how you think about your role today as a CEO of a company?
Yeah, I think my role was much as the CEO of Montra was much more natural when I stopped developing. I'm not a great developer, even on Bubble. A lot of it is transferable to, a regular tech stack. It's just, you're moving elements on a page versus, writing lines of code. That's not what I do very well. I really love product. I love ideation. I love design. I love, positioning. I love talking to customers. I think having a video creation background helps, throughout this process. But I would say that, the job of my job as the CEO of Montra right now is to really build this world-class team. And we're doing it again now. We're actively hiring for, full-time engineering roles, product design roles. We could talk about the second round, depending on when this will come out, actually. But the reality is that back in the day, I wasn't enjoying myself as much as I am now, right? And, I feel that Niels is a phenomenal engineer. He was when we were building, and Bubble happened to be our tech stack, and he is now with React. And you can see he's so happy in that position. And I'm really happy dealing with product and talking to customers and working on, solving these kind of user experience challenges and hiring and fundraising, all of the kind of key elements of the business beyond the underlying technology that I kind of do on a daily basis. And so I would say that it was never a conflict and it was very natural. There are stages of startup founders, right? And the early 0 to 0.1 was me and Figma and Bubble and a spreadsheet of people that said they want to use Montra. And 0 to 0.2, let's just say, is basically the phase we're in now, where we have a prototype, we got some awesome feedback, we're in a position now where we want to rebuild it and actually go to market in a wide way, take the learnings from our Bubble prototype and apply them into a very scalable tech stack.
Let's dive into some of the early technical challenges that you were facing. Now, when, I'm not doing so much coaching anymore, but I used to do a lot of private coaching for people who were just getting started on Bubble.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the most common questions that I would get from people who are brand new to the platform is like, hey, can my idea that I have work on Bubble? And I remember the first time we met, I'm thinking back to that email that you sent me and that first conversation we had where you were telling me about the product and showing me what you had already built.
Yeah.
I remember thinking to myself, like, if you had asked me that question about your particular idea, I don't know if I would have said, yes, this is like something that you can something that you can build on Bubble, even to the point that you guys did.
Mm-hmm.
And so I've always been amazed by what you guys were able to accomplish technically on Bubble. Take me back to those early days when you were building out this video creation tool. I think in the intro, either in the intro or at the end of this video, I'll do an actual walkthrough of the product to give people a better idea of what you guys have actually built. I think that would be helpful. But what were some of the biggest challenges from a technical point of view?
Yeah, for sure. So I can say this, it's really all with the APIs we're using. So I think if you could say the product we built on Bubble was, again, not really exclusively built on Bubble. It was powered by Bubble, built with a ton of various APIs that we layered together, and with a lot of contributions from the awesome Bubble plugin contributor team, I would say, as we were able to kind of learn and iterate. We went through a ton of various iterations, testing out various combinations of, plugins and APIs and, rendering engines and rendering it this way and that way and, recording with this camera versus that camera and all of these various things. And the reality is that none of them were wonderful, but most of the combinations were good enough. And I think there's an interesting differentiation there, right? Like if your goal is to build a video creation tool that's production ready on Bubble, I would probably, not do that, right? But our goal was much more at the time, hey, let's just test this thing. Like, let's just build something, let's test it, let's see if people like it, right? Instead of, burning through the $500K, hiring much more expensive full-time engineers and building something no one wants, right? Like, I'd rather have a buggy product that people will suffer through to, validate versus the other option, which is having a product that absolutely no one wants to use. And so to us, that was the goal, I would say. And when people ask like, hey, what can be built on Bubble? Like Montra was built on Bubble, but I would caveat that by saying like, there is a reason why we're leaving. And so I don't want to overhype what we were able to accomplish. That said, it did work. And, you were able to record and render and create engaging content. And certainly there were bugs, but like, the vast majority of what we did was, I would say, successful in that sense. And so, that was really cool. And, that was, while there were a lot of kind of painful roadblocks that we had to overcome, specifically around API integrations and, rendering and all of these, random Bubble bugs or whatever they may be, the vast majority of the products or of the features we built, and the way we executed it did end up working. And we got a lot of feedback because of it. And so,
did you make it farther than you thought you would?
Totally. Yeah. 100%. Yeah. I mean, I think in hindsight, like, I think a lot of the learnings did come from the summer. And so a part of me is like, maybe we should have kind of just bailed on Bubble in June. But the other part of me is like, well, we probably wouldn't have built the product from scratch that fast. And there were quite a bit of learnings that we leveraged throughout the summer. And so, I mean, in hindsight, like, I don't know if I would actually change anything. While it was painful in the moment, and not even for me, but for our team and for Niels and for everyone to kind of suffer through these bugs, the reality is that like it was definitely we've definitely like from the hardcore build, end of January or whatever, February, prototyping throughout that time, and then also the hardcore build from June to basically September, like that was that I couldn't have imagined that was even possible, on a no code platform, right? And so.
Yeah, me either, man. My full-time job was basically looking at apps that other people have built and getting in there and helping them work on it. Mm-hmm. And I was still blown away when I saw what you guys had built on Bubble. I think you really pushed the limits there. Did it ever get to a point where, because of how much you were able to accomplish, because it was much more than you thought you were able to accomplish on a no-code platform, Did you ever think like, hey, maybe we could stay on this more long term, whether that's the entire product or like pieces of the product? Did that ever
Yeah.
cross your mind?
Yeah, we explored all the options, right? Me and Niels. And, one of the ideas was a bubble front end and then, a React or like some kind of custom back end that was really thrown around throughout the summer. The reality is we just hit a point where we felt that, it's irresponsible for us to let the tech stack get in the way of our roadmap, right? And that was always the crossroads. Is like when our ambitions are held back by our tech stack, we are making a mistake. I can give an example here, which is just, the idea that we were rendering videos live in live time. So you'd record a video, it'd happen over, you'd record over a few slides or whatever it may be, and then that video would instantly be rendered. That obviously cost way more money and was not efficient. There's a way to do it where you can avoid that initial render and only render when you're actually exporting a video and fake it. And we had a really hard time faking it on Bubble because of the lag with the front end when you're compiling a bunch of videos together. And so things like that were starting to bother us. And like another example, this is funny. This will be funny to look back on. This only happened. This happened. This was kind of like in the summer, or maybe like September actually. It probably was September in hindsight, and kind of towards the end of the summer, right? A user, I'm not going to kind of leave his name out of it, but was recording a pretty long video. It was like over 50 minutes, 50. We didn't really test for long videos because that's kind of hard to test for. And he goes to export his video and the render kind of just, the loading state never goes away. And we had failed renders before, usually when things were a little busier, I guess. And by busier, we mean multiple people using it at the same time. Like that's how fragile the first version was. But the reality is that like he goes to email me, right? Because I'm kind of tech support, and says, hey, I think my render's gone. It's a 55-minute video. Like hopefully I can get that back. And it actually worked. The render worked well. Didn't take too long. The problem was that the file was so big that Bubble's front end couldn't upload it. So it was stuck in this infinite loading stage. So our solution was to just share this, download this video ourselves on our back end. My co-founder Niels got it from our servers, which were hosted on AWS separately from Bubble, right, via the rendering engine we were using. We then uploaded it to a shared Google Drive folder and then sent it to this guy. And so that's the stage of the company we were in the summer, which is like, taped together, popsicle stick and duct tape phase. And part of me is a little embarrassed by that. And part of me is like super proud of that. And I think it's fair to kind of tread in the middle, right? I think that you don't want to be there long term, but this is what it takes, I would say, in the early days to make something work. And the reality is that he suffered through that and, was fine. Ultimately, the video worked out well and it was all good. So I'm really excited by, the prospects of having a product that's super stable and works really well and is like the React product will not compare to the Bubble product, but we wouldn't have been able to build the React product with the conviction that we have had we not built the Bubble product. So it's kind of like a chicken or the egg thing.
Yeah, and to touch on the point you made about being half embarrassed and half really proud of where you guys were at. I mean, I was thinking as you said that about other podcasts that I've listened to, like the guys from Airbnb come to mind. I think in the early days, they actually would fly out and take pictures for their users and like post them on the website themselves. And anyways, the point I'm making is like every great founder story that I've ever listened to seems like it was kind of duct taped together in the beginning and they were very much
totally
just
and that's why Bubble is such a powerful tool. Like to go back to the age-old question, right, of like, can this be built on Bubble? I would say it really depends. My general consensus would be if you're leveraging a ton of APIs, I would probably not do anything beyond a basic prototype or temper your expectations, right? And I think that's something we probably could have improved on. Like I think we probably we were surprised by how far we got, but our ambitions were so high that ultimately it just, we made the decision to pull the plug. The reality is that it was not wasted time because there were just a ton of learnings throughout that period. And if we look at like most products, like if you're building a note-taking tool or even some of the cool stuff with like GTB3, like a copy AI thing, like a lot of that probably could be built on Bubble, right? And like there's a lot of really interesting, if it's like a marketplace for a dog owner, like whatever it may be, right? Like the Airbnb clone, like a lot of these tools, if it's web-based, can actually perform quite well, right? The The product looked good. It was beautiful. It generally functioned well. It was just really challenging integrating a bunch of APIs and all the states that are involved with video editing and rendering. And our project file was a mess. And there were all these kind of things that added up that ultimately made it harder and harder to kind of continue down the course with the Bubble product. But for many products, like Bubble's a phenomenal tool. And like take Montra aside, like this is the journey this is the company I want to build for the next 10 years. When I was younger, I would like, try out a project, kind of lose interest, move on to something else. And then when you really find something that you're really excited to work on and build, it's all you can think about. And that's really how I feel right now with Montra. But if I was to imagine myself starting another company someday, for most of the use cases, if it's a software product, like I would absolutely build a prototype on Bubble. That would probably be the first thing I did, right? I just need to learn the new responsive engine because I'm terrible at it still. And your tutorials kind of helped, but like I'm still working on it.
Yeah, well, I also released those like right when the responsive engine came out, so they're a little bit outdated now.
That's how I found you. But
oh yeah, that's right. Actually,
they
I
were
remember
good
you
videos.
mentioning that in the email.
So I was like, oh, you should be doing this on Montra anyway. But the reality is that when you kind of come to the tool and play around with it, etc., there are all these things that I think that work in our favor. But long term, probably makes more sense to do it in React, and that's exactly what we're doing.
So I'm curious to know what that's like for you, that transition, in the sense that, when you're inside of Bubble, you had built this prototype yourself. You're familiar with the editor, even if you don't feel, if your skills aren't that great on the new responsive engine, but you know how things are laid out, like how Bubble works. What's that like for you getting into something like React, where you have this repository and just a bunch of code in all these different files?
Well, the short answer is I'm not really getting into it at all, frankly.
It seems like you like that. It seems like you're comfortable where you are.
Extraordinarily comfortable. Yeah, this is Niels's bread and butter. He's a wonderful developer. He's led teams before. He's really, he is in full control here. And I think part of a healthy co-founder relationship is mutual respect for each other's roles. It's not my job to start to get involved in the repository and code base. I make suggestions in terms of APIs that I think would be cool based on our learnings from Bubble. But ultimately, whether it's hiring an engineering candidate or someone that's really going to work with Niels or impact him day to day, it's his call, right? The same reason I would hope that he wouldn't start lecturing me about the best fundraising strategies, or the best. He chimes in a lot on product, but I don't know, product design stuff, something that I care a lot about. And so, and I'll correct you in a sec. Like I really, from February onwards, especially from May or April onwards, I was really not in the Bubble product at all, right? I was shaping it from a product design perspective and a product overview perspective, but I was not involved in the actual development of it. I was not like in there, the workflows like are intense. They look completely foreign to me. The product that I built is not the product that this is, right? And that was really, to be fair, that was really started to take place kind of towards the beginning of 2022. And so, I would say like if you were trying to parody your product on Bubble, that would be a little painful, right? Because you feel like you're going backwards. You're like, well, I could just continue to iterate on Bubble, or I can redo it on React. That's less of what we're doing. There are enough meaningful changes that this is going to be our V1 release, our stable version. There's going to be a ton of fun stuff that we're going to be including in this release that haven't been included in prior releases. And that's exciting. We're going to be pushing the bounds of what's possible, not just beyond Bubble, but, in a technical setting, especially from a user experience perspective. We think we're going to deliver something really fresh and exciting that will provide a lot of people value. And so,
okay, I want to circle back to that.
Yeah.
To just talk about how you listen to user feedback while you're iterating so fast and knowing which users to listen to, because I think that is a tricky challenge in and of itself. But last question on the technical front. I know that Niels is not here right now, but if you were to speak for him and guess, I think I remember you saying that originally when you met him and you guys were working together, that he was feeling a little hesitant about building on no code.
Totally.
Because of his background. So how do you think, I guess, his views have evolved about no code and just in general?
He's handled it like a champ. You're right. I can't speak for him. If I was to try to assume what he would say, I think he would not recommend building a video creation tool on Bubble long term. And I stand by that as well. That
I
said,
mean, you guys never planned to.
no, not at all. But we, never, not at all long term. But short term, he would absolutely acknowledge the value it provided in terms of, quickly building stuff and iterating and stuff. And I think he was quite impressed by what you could actually do aside from the API thing. Like, had we been not integrating all these APIs in the rendering engine, and we were building, I don't know, a marketplace for like selling snacks or whatever, like chances are like we would still be on Bubble, right? Because that, our vision would not be held back by the technical, stack that we were using. So he's very excited to have a proper engineering team and, build in React. So I can definitely say that, he's looking forward to this next phase and is really diving deep. But going back to, the summer, there were a lot of learnings, and he kind of acknowledged that there was a lot of, things that we can figure out. And the reality is Bubble was really good at forcing you to leverage APIs and forcing you to really figure out what worked and what didn't, right? There are a lot of APIs we tried out in Bubble that didn't work well. And we could say, all right, we're not going to use these when we build our production release, right? And that was a lot of what we spent the summer doing, trying different combinations of various APIs, rendering engines, trimming engines, camera recorders, like all sorts of different things that are super relevant to the core product we're building today. So I can't speak for Niels. You'd have to ask him, and maybe it'd be fun to have him on the pod at some point. But the reality is that as we were kind of building out the product, I think Niels's conviction in Bubble started to dramatically increase and then fall off a cliff towards the very end as things got really tough. But the reality is like he obviously he never entered the arena with a pure skepticism. That's what I love about him. He's much more of a, this is interesting. Like, let's see what we can do. And he really embraced it. And like a champ, honestly. In hindsight, like, it's very intimidating to learn a completely new tech stack that you're basing the prototypes of the company on.
Yeah, very cool. I mean, I don't know anything about Niels aside from what you've said in this conversation, but it sounds like someone I'd love to talk to on the podcast. So maybe we should make that happen in the future. But let's go back to what I think falls into your camp, at least at this point in your guys' life cycle as a startup, and that's listening to user feedback. Now, you mentioned earlier that this was not something that maybe came naturally to you when you were first building your prototype. It was something that this startup incubator pushed. So were you resistant to do that, or did you just not know that you were supposed to do that like many startup founders do? What was that like?
It was a mix. I think once we started to get in the hang of it and I started to hear repeat things from potential customers back in November, December of 2021, I began to embrace it more. And I would say that it is something I heard quite a bit on the podcast. I just assumed that was maybe something I would do a little later on, maybe that it was a little too early, which in hindsight is kind of, dumb, but, I was a first time founder. And I think that, Mark at the studio in particular was really kind of had seen this many times and really pushed me. And it's so interesting how you can talk to a few people, come to a conclusion, talk to a few more, come to another conclusion, and then talk to 10 people or 20 people and come to a completely different, much more informed conclusion. And when you start to see patterns emerge in these conversations, which I did, you can start to, ideate and iterate on a product and build features around, specific elements, right? That was the most exciting part with the Bubble. And it was a prototype I built myself on Bubble, but it really didn't work, right? So it wasn't like a functioning product. It was just a series of workflow. It was like a more glorified version of what you could do with Figma. And it was like, simple pitch beta, right? And it had a video and it looked like it was working perfectly, but it didn't. And this was back in November, More recently, the product that we used in the summer and that I used to make our raise video and all of those things, that was a real functioning. That was the Bubble product that we've talked in length about. That was different than this initial prototype. But in November, I take this prototype, shop it around, email people, hop on a Zoom call, get their feedback, note down their feedback, iterate on the product, show it to a new person, get their feedback, note down that feedback, continue to iterate on the product, and not necessarily build feature after feature after I hear it once. But over time, you start to see trends like, where can I read off my speaker notes? Or like, I take a sticky note and put it right under my camera. And it's like, oh, well, what if we just put the script right up there? And you push a button and the script drops down and you could read off it and maintain eye contact. And I remember like testing it out. I was like, say, okay, if the script needs to go here, I'm like at home and I click record on my like regular, photo booth Mac webcam. And I'm like, it kind of looks like I'm maintaining eye contact. Like, that's kind of cool. And then I built that in. And then you show it to someone and I'm like, and they're like, well, what about the script? What about the speaker notes? And I push the button and they're like, oh my God, that's amazing. And that's super cool, right? Like that live iteration. So I started with audio over slides, right? Which was like my very basic, very simply informed idea, and turned into a fully fledged video editor that leveraged the interface of Google Slides. And of course, there was a much more learning from January through March. And a lot of that was fundraising, and Niels was finishing school, and so we were in still that prototyping phase, but we were actually building real product at that point. But that learning, that foundation of learnings was really, really helpful, and we ultimately went out to push our prototype and beta out this summer.
So do you have like a framework or some sort of like mental checklist that you use when you're listening to user feedback to kind of evaluate this is something worth listening to, or not something, or maybe it's not worth paying much attention to this piece of feedback? Or is it more just patterns, like you said, over time that keep coming up again and again?
Yeah, I'm not super, again, like I'm hesitant to give this advice because I've only done this once, and TBD on whether or not we're successful. I wouldn't have raised money had I not thought we had a really great shot. But the reality is that we're a startup; they're still unknown, and so it's hard to look at even like, and analyzing what went well and wrong with the Bubble product. Pretty hard to tell right now, right? I'll just, as a caveat, right, because that was only a few months ago, and so we're well resourced now, but that doesn't mean that we will be forever. And so just want to mention that. I would say, like, so I think this could be taken too far. Like 100 customer interviews, is that really necessary? Maybe, but we definitely didn't do that. I think at around 10, 7 maybe, you really start to hear patterns. And when I would text some startup founders that I was, friendly with, that were much further along, that had raised 10, 20, 30, $50 million and had big companies, a lot of them would say, like, once you start to hear repeat things, you start to make patterns in these conversations, you're onto something. And the reality is, and another piece of advice that I got, which is super true, is you cannot, interview your way to product market fit. That's not how this works. And like, I would not claim to have found product market fit yet. And so we're not there. And I think that's case in point, right? And so I think we'll get there eventually. And I think that will be what, 23, especially Q1, 2, 3 will be really important for us. But the reality is, like, these conversations helped inform that we were on the right track. And that was about it. The rest was the hard work. You actually have to build something, right? And you have to figure out, what you're working on and who is positioned for. And I think that, like, I've heard a lot of, I think talking to customers is wonderful, but if you don't necessarily like leverage the patterns in those conversations, what's the point, right? Oftentimes you could talk to customers and invalidate products. For us, we invalidated a lot of features that I thought were going to be super important that turned out to be completely irrelevant. And, the little things like the script view, which frankly I was like, oh, that's cool, but like, who cares? Turned out to be like super exciting. And so you do it then. We did it in the summer as we onboard people. That was also a crazy interesting thing. You get a ton of learnings from onboarding people. So there were a lot of kind of like little things we figured out along the way. But basing your product in a series of conversations, I would say it doesn't necessarily have to be 25, from my opinion. I think 7 to 10 is really what did the trick for us initially. I mean, we did more than that, but if we stopped at 10, would the company be very different? I'm not convinced. So, I think that ultimately, it's a ongoing thing. You don't just do it once and then completely never talk to another customer again. And like, we went through a period of a few months from kind of January through the raise where we were less active talking to customers, and then in the summer kind of ramped up again. And it takes a lot of time, but it always feels so good to really understand if you're on the right track or not. But again, not going to get you to product market. It's not going to, you like, talking to customers alone is not how you'll find product market fit.
Yeah. When I think back to when I was first learning Bubble and building my first product, and I, went into a cave for 6 months and didn't talk to anyone. And then the first time I did try to get user feedback, I remember sitting down and talking to a potential customer, and he gave me, he was like, hey, this looks really great, but it'd be cool if it had this feature here. And I was blown away, first of all, that I'd like never thought of that feature, and that it was also something that like a potential customer wanted. Mm-hmm. And that kept happening again over and over with different people that I talked to. Be like, it's really cool what you're building, but it'd be nice to have this one feature here. And I found myself just,
you're a dev shop at that point.
Well, exactly. Yeah. And so like, I had this smorgasbord of an app, and I found it really challenging to know who to listen to and like when to build a feature versus when to say, you know what, this may be cool for this person, but it's not really what I want this product to be. It's not what this product is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I think it's a really challenging thing.
The advice I got from the studio was just the following, which is, you essentially need to look at it from the following lens, which is, who are you building this for, right? And I think I fell into the trap that it has to be this one use case, educational content, which turns out like way bigger of a market than that. But the reality is that I think that when you start to see patterns, and it's not going to be super obvious. Not everyone's going to be like, well, I want a script. And then the next person is going to say, give me a script. And then the third person is going to say, give me a script. And you're like, fine, I'll do a script. Like, that's an easy thing to figure out. That's connect the dots, right? Oftentimes you'll hear someone say, well, one of the challenges I have is I have a hard time, like, staying on point, right? Or I have a hard time, like, reading my lines. Or I often screw up. When I'm recording over my slide, I often forget what I want to say. And then someone would be like, where are my speaker notes, right? And then you're like, oh, they're actually saying the same thing, which is they want a place to be able to look that doesn't lose eye. Or like, what do you hate about recording video? Well, I hate how whenever I read off my notes, I lose eye contact. So how could we solve those two like the solution was not, to like try to engineer a way to lower the camera. Like that would be taking that for face value. The solution was to figure out a way that you could read off your script and maintain eye contact. How can we do both of those at once? And so that was essentially what we really focused on, was optimizing for those patterns. And it took a while, and a lot of, like most of the credit here goes to Krem and Mark and their team, who was really patient with me as I was kind of figuring this out. And frankly, a lot of other startup founders and advisors that helped me along the way. As I was, working with the studio, I would also kind of double check things with various startup friends of mine. And the advice was pretty uniform. And so I think that ultimately was beneficial long term.
This next question might be an annoying one, but I'm going to ask it anyways. And that is, I get the feeling, and I've had this feeling every single time I speak with you, that I'm speaking with someone who's much older than 19 years old.
Oh, that's nice of you to say.
How, like, when I was 19 years old, I was playing in a band and I was screwing around and just doing all sorts of really stupid stuff. Not to say that playing in a band is a stupid thing to do.
I played in
I'm
a
not saying
band,
that at all.
I was an alto sax player.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah.
Nice. Do you still do that at all?
I lost it, and it's one of my biggest regrets in my life. Yeah, I was...
Really?
I played when I was younger. I mean, I say that half jokingly, but to be honest, like, would I want this skill set again? Totally, and eventually I'll get back into it. I played in a jazz band. We ranked second, or maybe gold in, like, Ontario, I guess, provincials. We went to Ottawa, and we played... we played a bunch of songs, but it was really fun. And I was definitely the lead. I was not great because I didn't practice, but I was able to, like, I was good enough to meet the benchmark of the team. But ultimately, like, you start to hit this point. I found like grade 6, maybe it was grade 8, maybe, or grade 7, 8, where the kids are basically aiming to be professional musicians, and I like didn't want that, and so it was so competitive, and it stopped being fun. But not trying to derail what you just said.
The fun thing about playing music now, I'm 32, and playing it, I don't play nearly as much as I'd like, but when I do pick up a guitar now, I just have fun playing music for music's sake.
Totally.
When I was in a band, I was very much like writing music to try to put out an album, or it felt like a job, really. I was committed to that full time, and it felt like anything that you're committed to full time feels like when you're really trying to make a go at it.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not to say that I wasn't enjoying at the time playing music, but it's definitely different now when I'm not trying to do anything to show someone. I'm just playing music.
I love it. And like, that's the goal, man. I think, like,
yeah.
And I'm really trying to get better at this. Yeah. Like I think that for my whole life, I've had one goal, which is like build a tech company. And
when did that happen?
I think I was like 13, and my dad introduced me, who's not interested in tech, he's not in tech, but he was into podcasts. He was like one of the first podcast listeners I was aware of. This is like 2012, 2013, 2014. And I think in 2015, I first listened to the podcast Startup by Alex Bloomberg, and he documents the best show in the history of the world, documents the inception of starting a media company, Gimlet Media. And it's so phenomenal that I would encourage anyone interested in tech or media or startups to listen to it, because he does such an amazing job articulating the struggle that is starting a company. And you get to live that experience, or you get to live that experience through him, basically. And, the struggles of fundraising, the struggles of building a team, the struggles of building culture and managing expectation and delivering products, and all of the challenges that I face day to day are articulated in a much more romantic way via that podcast. It's not romanticized per se, but it's elegantly put together. And so, he was a former NPR producer at This American Life and Planet Money and all of these things, and then went on to start this company. And so I listened to that and thought, wow, that's amazing. Like, I was only interested in video creation at the time because I just started out pretty young because I was bored and there was no TikTok. And so I got dopamine from making content. Makes me a little worried now if I don't want to sound too old, but like if every time you're bored, you just go on your phone on Twitter and TikTok, like how do you, get good at something? And how do you be bored?
Well, also,
and
how do you be okay with being bored?
Yeah, exactly. How do you solve for that? Nonetheless, totally different topic. And so that podcast really, inspired me and ultimately inspired me to do my own show a few years later. And then I cold emailed him and actually ended up flying to Brooklyn to interview him. It was incredible and like super lucky to be able to do that. And so I think from that perspective, my lifelong goal is always to run a tech company. And, it's interesting. Like people say I kind of sound older than I am. And then a lot of people say I look a lot younger than I am. So I don't know where that puts me, probably at around the same age. But the reality is that I just have felt that the idea that maybe you have to kind of have this much more robust career before you can start a tech company was a little silly. And I was probably, frankly, at the end of the day, was impatient. I think that's ultimately what this whole thing is about, right? It's not that I'm impatient with Montra. I now have like a 10-year time horizon, and that's really exciting. But I would not want to start Montra, and probably it would be impossible to start Montra when I was 29 or 30 because the opportunity wouldn't exist anymore. And so when I get excited about an opportunity and see something, that's all I could think about. Everything else is irrelevant to me. It's all I want to do. And I'm like an obsessive, freak from that perspective. And that made it so I was really interested in startups for a while. And starting a company and raising money, this is like a dream of mine and has been for quite some time. And it's just a lot of trial and error and a lot of figuring it out, right? And when I was younger, I would look up to the founders who were 18, 19, 20, 21, who were starting companies and think, oh my God, like I'll never be like them. They must be so smart. And then you meet these people and like they're not idiotic. They're intelligent for sure, but they're not smarter than you or I, right? I'm not a genius by any means. I was a mediocre student at best, right? I was not entertained at school at all. And so, what differentiates, them from most people is that they just took the jump, right? They just had a higher pain tolerance and just suffered a little longer. And there are some people who make it look easy and then you kind of get to meet them and you're like, damn, like work went into this. This is years of foundation that you started building when you were 13. So good for you, right? You weren't playing video games. You were like programming and like, you should kind of get the rewards of your labor, the fruits of your labor, if that was your situation. And so I think I'm not as of an extreme example of that, but I was, if people ask me like, what are your hobbies? And it's like company building. Like I love what I do. Like this is what I do for fun. So going back to band, I think it'd be nice to I want to be really good at something beyond starting startups. And I'm not saying I'm really good at that, but if I do it for the next 10 years, I probably will be. And so I think that I would love to be really good at something beyond startups to kind of have another part of my identity. But for the time being, I'm pretty happy.
Well, Campbell, throughout this podcast have opened up a whole number of different rabbit holes that I feel like I could dive down with you and that we could talk for like 10 hours about any one of them. But yeah, man, thanks for coming on. Super stoked to track your journey with Montra and to follow you and to see all the things you're doing. Like I said, I think like your perspective at this age is incredible. Even just some of the stuff that you just said there. Like, I don't know how especially what you said about when you turn, like in 10 years, what would it be like to start Montra, and how you already know that it's just going to be like way different and much harder. I mean, it feels like one of those obvious things. And when I was 19, if someone had I think maybe like I intellectually knew that, but I didn't actually feel that, it felt like at 19, I could do whatever I want and that everything would always be that way. So the fact that you're able to have these different perspectives is I find it really amazing. So anyways, man, thanks for coming on the show. I'm stoked to chat with you, and let's do it again. Where can people find you online?
Well, first and foremost, thanks for having me. Thank you for the kind words. I appreciate it. I can be found on Twitter, TikTok at Campbell J. Barron, CAMPBELL, the letter J, and then BARON. And more importantly, Montra and the startup that I'm building that we're hiring, product designers and engineers for, even though this is a no-code podcast. If you do possess the skill sets of a full stack developer, shoot me an email and kind of check out our careers page. So Montra, montra.co/careers. It's cool to have a careers page and to be able to point people in that direction. And beyond that, I would say one other elephant in the room is that Jacob and I are both Canadian builders and Canadian founders. And one of the things we didn't talk about is I think the entrepreneurial boom that is happening in this country. And I think it's awesome that I don't have to be in San Francisco and you could be in Calgary and I can be in Toronto or Vancouver, and we could raise money from American investors and build an awesome company that creates Canadian jobs and contributes to this wonderful ecosystem. So not trying to get too patriotic here, but definitely a lot of the early success we've had at Montra is as a result of kind of the luck and timing of being born in a great country.
Amazing. Well said. All right, man. Well, we'll have to dive into that whole rabbit hole again next time. But thank you so much for coming on, and thanks for watching, everyone. See you in the next episode. Bye-bye.